for the Economics of the Internet here at the Hudson Institute. We're very fortunate today to have with us Stephen Crocker, the chairman of ICON. Before we get to Mr. Crocker's talk today, just a couple of housekeeping matters. First of all, I would like to invite you for next week, December 18th, when we'll have Richard Wiley, former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, will be here speaking about the agenda for the next FCC. That will be at noon on December 18th. I'd also like to welcome our online audience, and please feel free to submit questions for Mr. Crocker, and the information on that we have at Hudson Institute. That's the Twitter. That's the Twitter tag is at Hudson Institute, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of Mr. Crocker's talk. It's rare in Washington to have someone speak who can actually legitimately claim to be the father of the Internet. And we're very fortunate today to have with us Stephen Crocker, who was one of the early pioneers in the development of the Internet. Mr. Crocker has had a long and distinguished career. I'm convinced he never sleeps because he has both his private company, which probably takes about 80 hours a week, as well as chairing the ICON board. That's probably another 180 hours a week. That's probably another 80 hours a week, and if my math is correct, that probably leaves him about 9 hours a week to sleep. And I don't know that he needs that much. This is an extremely timely event because as we speak, the ITU is meeting to consider various proposals for the future of telecommunications, some of which have substantial implications for the Internet. With that, let me turn things over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Harold, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I actually assiduously avoid trying to claim any parentage for the Internet.
I know you do, and that's why I do it for you.
Thank you, but also it's a well-occupied position already. Yes. There are others, Bob Kahn and Vince Cerf, who are widely touted as the fathers of the Internet, and both are good friends, longtime colleagues, and I would not want to attempt to compete with them for that title. By accidents of time and place, I did have the privilege of being involved from very early days, helped put the first node of the Arpanet in service at UCLA, and from that perspective was also heavily involved in a somewhat unusual sequence of events that led to the creation of the protocols for the Arpanet, which then became transformed into the Internet, and some of the social processes that have evolved into the institutions that are heavily related to the Internet. So unintentionally, but one gets the privilege of looking back and seeing this whole arc of 40 plus years. So it's mainly from that perspective that I come today to share things. As you pointed out, the ITU is holding a major meeting in Dubai as we speak. I used to think that a meeting was a day or two, and meetings got to be pretty long when they took up all of a working week, Monday through Friday. The ITU meetings start out at 2 weeks, and then they put a pair of them back to back, and so you spend a month in Dubai with WITSA followed by WICET. And it's the WICET meeting that is in its second week right now, and it is reviewing the international telecommunication regulations which are the implementation of the treaty for the basically the international phone system. And that's where the high drama is, because in principle, they can make changes to these regulations that can have very far-reaching effect. And quite obviously, the merger, the convergence of the telephone system and the internet and the blurring of those boundaries and all of the consequences related to that are where a lot of action and attention is. I'll say a bit more about this in a more orderly way, but I wanted to share give a snippet of the sort of action on the ground there. One of our colleagues sent a message at 2 a.m. last night, Dubai time. Dubai is 9 hours ahead of there, so this is like 5 o'clock for us. And I didn't get his permission, but he sent it to enough of us so that I don't think it's going to be too sensitive here. And he writes to inform us, the plenary this evening approved a package of text on relatively non-controversial issues such as emergency services, accounting rates, and CLI. I don't even know what CLI is. But did not address in any detail the chairman's draft ITR text DT51-E, which was attached to earlier email, and here again. This text is supposed in the main to represent a compromise that was presented to a closed group of heads of regions and vice chairs that met this afternoon. None of it is agreed, but there is a presumption that those parts not in square brackets has been accepted in principle. Specific text in square brackets include text on non-discriminatory access, on naming and addressing, which are germane to the ICANN mission, text relating to the ETNO proposal, and on security and spam. There is then the internet resolution. It is worth noting that the text includes an agreed approach on operating authorities versus recognized operating authorities, which for most is effectively what we had with recognized operating authorities before, and accepts ITU recommendations will not be binding. There is also no definition of telecommunications versus ICT. There is substantial opposition to nearly all of the bracketed text, although there is some acceptance, especially among the EU, but also in the US, that an internet resolution may have to be part of an overall deal. We are thus working with the Internet Society and the US government to secure much better text should it be needed. The plenary to consider the chairman's paper will resume at 9:30 and will carry on through the day and evening. An agreed text is hoped for by Thursday morning. You think sausage making is complicated in this town. This is what goes on halfway around the world. And then he goes on with a bit more analysis. This is a hell of a way to run things, I would say. We have deals being brokered in late night and side meetings, as opposed to a more orderly and transparent and let me emphasize, a more orderly process in which things are on the table and get to be considered, and you get to reach a stable process. So I very, very carefully have avoided in my life trying to spend much time in that arena. As I said, I had the privilege of being involved in the technology side of the internet, starting first with the Arpanet back in the late 60s, early 70s, and to the extent necessary, got involved in a very lightweight way in the governance aspects, and then moved in and out and more gradually into governance aspects. And now I'm tempted to try to burlesque the Gilbert and Sullivan line about now I am a captain in the Queen's Navy, that I'm now chairman of the board of ICANN, which gets an extraordinary amount of attention in the internet governance space. So let me step back a bit and draw a picture of history from my perspective, which is necessarily incomplete and unbalanced in a particular way, but the intent is to try to make sense out of what feels like gobbledygook coming out of the ITU versus other things you'll see in the newspapers and from various other reports. And most particularly to try to relate the interplay between technology on the one hand and the social and governance and political structures on the other hand, and money obviously plays a role somewhere along in here. And between those two big forces, the technology on the one side and the politics slash economics on the other side, there are also things that are not explained by either, which I'll just put down under the heading of accidents. Alternate histories could have come about. So the telephone system is built first and foremost on two important things. One are wires, circuits, that in the olden days were big, expensive things that needed a lot of investment and a lot of control. So you had rights of way for where to put wires, and then all the things necessary to protect that. And then you needed, excuse me, switches. Progressively larger and bigger pieces of equipment that used to be built out of relays or even hand operated in the earliest days, and then turned into more and more complicated computer-based mechanisms that came from Bell Labs and Western Electric and various manufacturers. And the technology also was that all of the services were defined and controlled by the telephone company. Once upon a time, we had, in essence, one telephone company before the breakup of AT&T. And even so, the mechanism is still pretty much a small number of fairly large telephone companies and very strong control of the technology that is used inside the phone system. The notion of what service is provided by the phone system and the way in which it's provided is controlled in a small set of places and well-defined and specified, and systems are manufactured to meet those specifications, and it is not a process that you can engage in very easily. That's the technology and some aspects of the business. Other consequences from a business point of view is that the investments are traditionally were based upon a very, very long baseline for rate of return. It used to be 40 years for the return on investment. And that leads to or is intertwined with government control, with monopolies being allocated to the local phone companies, and to government regulations to substitute for market forces, to set rates, to approve changes, and to control all that process. And in turn, that leads to huge investments in growing the part of the business that deals with the regulations. And so if you look at a modern phone company, you will find some number of people actually devoted to making the phone system work, and a very large number of other people who are devoted to interacting with the government, lobbying or representing the phone company and before the FCC, for example, and all the other aspects of that process. A separate but related aspect is that because of the embedding of the business model into the technology, about a third of the phone system mechanism is devoted to the billing system. So the billing system is not just a small little thing that you sort of put a gauge on the side of things and take some measurements off. A huge fraction of the cost of running the phone system is the cost of producing the bills and dealing with all that. From an international perspective, the history is that the phone system grew up on a country basis. So every country had its own phone system. They were usually have been government monopolies, and then the interaction between these phone systems is controlled through through international treaties and very careful management of settlement fees, which become a very big deal from an economics point of view, particularly for disadvantaged countries where the inflow of money due to these settlement fees can be a very important factor both in the economy and sometimes, even more importantly, within the particular government bureaus that control all of that. In that environment, the standards for the technical standards that control all of this are controlled very closely and very carefully and in a top-down fashion. And from an institution's point of view, it leads to institutions like our Federal Communications Commission, like the International Telecommunications Union, that is the UN Treaty Organization, state public utility commissions, and so forth. And the rate of innovation and evolution within the phone system is relatively low compared to, that is, the speed of change is relatively low compared to the speed of change in the computer and information technology industries that we've all experienced over our lifetime. And back quite some time ago, there were even rules that prohibited interconnecting the phone system with anything else until you had the landmark Carter phone decision that made it legal to attach a telephone device that was not made by AT&T or Western Electric. There was also one other thing that doesn't get a lot of attention, in that in addition to being able to dial up one place to another and place a phone call, there was another form of service available from the phone companies, which was a leased circuit. It was possible to buy a circuit from one point to another that was, in essence, an always-on, always-open, non-dialable circuit. So you could put a handset at one end and a handset at the other end, and they would always be in communication. You could talk back and forth. And there was a price available for that. And then rules about what you could attach to it and how you could deal with that. So that's the technology of the phone system, sketched in as I say, in a very quick and probably biased and uneven way, that governed, that described the phone system from the early 1900s through, call it the 60s or so. And of course, with the breakup of AT&T, you have a lot of other forces in place that have caused evolution just within the phone system. But meanwhile, alongside of all of this, back in the late 60s, early 70s, we began to focus on connecting computers together. There had been some experiments prior to that time, but they had not amounted to much. It was technically difficult to do, and many of the experiments didn't actually succeed. And then the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, an organ of the Department of Defense that was created in reaction to Sputnik, with a mission of trying to prevent technological surprise, and has a very rich history of doing a lot of amazing things. One portion of that agency was focused on advanced research in computer science. And in that office, there had been support for research in, and I'm talking about the eras, the sort of early to mid 1960s, research in artificial intelligence, research in advanced computer architectures, research in advanced graphics, research in a little bit in computer security, advanced programming languages, processing of speech and processing of signals in general, and a number of exciting database technology, exciting technologies of the day. And that research was sponsored and carried out at principally the major research universities across the country and some research institutions. So we're talking about Harvard, MIT, Berkeley, Carnegie Mellon University, and many others, several others. A few dozen is probably the right count across the country. In that environment, this office, that was called the Information Processing Techniques Office, initiated a kind of big new push, leap forward, if you will, in networking, with the idea of connecting these computers in the research laboratories together. And and this project was discussed and sort of formulated around 1967, formally kicked off in 1968 with specific plans and a request for proposals. And then a contract was let with Bolt, Beranek, and Newman in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to build the first version of what you would now call a router. So a router these days, you can go down to Best Buy and you can buy a little box for, last time I did it was $30 or so. But the first versions were small refrigerator-sized computers that were adapted for the purpose. The price tag in $1969 was $100,000 a piece, multiplied by about 5 to get you to today's baseline. And so you're talking about, in today's terms, $500,000 for each one of these boxes, and you needed at least one in every site. So this was a somewhat expensive venture. Nonetheless, that's what happened. So that network was built in the late 60s, early 70s, and gradually expanded at the astonishing rate of adding one node every month, which is nothing by today's standards, but was a big deal at the time. And that was a single network as viewed through the lens from today. And then there were other networks that needed to be built and that were being built, and I'll come to that in a second. One of the key things, and I mentioned sort of three factors: technology and business/politics and accidents. And let me mention what I view as a couple of accidents in this process. Because this started off as a research effort, it was not viewed as real by sort of the real world, by businesses, major companies, and so forth. And hence, it was not a threat. That gave it a very long period to develop and evolve before it emerged as a major force in the economy. Wasn't even interesting. We had a major unveiling of the Arpanet in October 1972 at the Hilton up on the hill. And folks from AT&T came, looked at it, turned up their noses and walked away and said, not interesting. And there were some discussion about trying to get AT&T interested in taking over the network or developing it further, and they just wouldn't engage. The focus was on connecting computers together. It happened that the idea of packet switching, breaking information up into discrete little units like telegrams and routing each one of those separately by putting an address on the front of it and having these routers, which are little computers, look at the address and figure out the next path to put it in, whether to send it out port 1 or port 2 or port 3 in different directions, was available at the same time. And so you had a happy coincidence that the business of connecting computers together, which you could do in a number of different ways. You could have just put wires down between all computers, or you could have used some other techniques, fit very nicely with this notion of rapid packet switching. When you place a phone call and you dial it up, it takes a long time measured by computer standards to complete that call, to set up that circuit. In human times, it's a few seconds, and so that's tolerable. But when you try to connect computers together, if you have to wait several seconds before you can get the first piece of information to go from one computer to another, and you're only sending a little bit of information at a time, and you're sending these in bursts, which is the normal mode of operation for computers, rather than having a big stream that you want to send that takes hours to send. That's a very rare situation. Then this idea of packet switching is a very, very nice fit. So in a sense, that was opportune, and I've listed it as an accident. There are other points of view, but in any case, that came together. Another very peculiar element in the design of the Arpanet is quite remarkable. I mentioned that this network was built using the existing supported laboratories. So we had a captive audience. We had a couple dozen research places that were doing high-quality research, had relatively smart people, were on the cutting edge of computer science research, and one other extremely important attribute, they weren't allowed to say no. Washington said, we're going to give you this network. And when Washington says we're going to give you something, the answer is, well, thank you. Not everybody actually was keen to have this network intrude upon their laboratories. And in fact, there was a little bit of, as it turned out, a difference. The institutions on the East Coast tended, as a class, to be somewhat resistant. Why do we need this network? People are going to be taking the resources that we have. We have a very fine network, a very fine facility, our computer center, say, at MIT that is supporting our research. We like very much, thank you. Whereas there was a higher degree of receptiveness on the West Coast. So the network was grown from the West Coast toward the East Coast after the first few nodes were installed, and it was clear that this network was useful and was coming along. The attitude shifted rapidly, and everybody wanted to be attached to it. That was one element, a rich user environment. And now here's the most peculiar aspect. I mentioned that there was a contract that was formally given to Bolt, Brannick, and Newman to build what you would call routers today. They were called IMPs in those days. There was no formal tasking, no formal contract, no formal work plan for the rest of the network. What do I mean by the rest of the network? Well, the question is, so you put these routers down, you connect up wires, you buy lease lines from AT&T. What are you going to do with this network? What is the what applications, what services are you going to put on this network? Was left completely open, completely undefined. And instead, it was more of a field of dreams approach. Let the people who are now saddled, now burdened with this network, figure out what it is that they're going to do with it. So the users at each of these sites, and by users, we're now talking about professors who are the heads of these research projects and their students or staff people who are working at these universities or at these research institutions, try to figure out what to do. Sort of in exactly the what you would say is if you read any textbook on project management is exactly what not to do. They just left it open and instead invited the people who were at these sites to talk to each other. And so we did. And in talking to each other, we had no guidance, a completely open blank sheet of paper, basically. And we said, all right, we get the basic idea. We're going to connect up these computers. We have a basic idea of what capability that's going to give us in terms of this computer can talk to that computer, it can say something. What should it say? What do we want to do with it? The easy things were two. We'd like to be able to act as if we were connected to a remote computer, just as if we were a user on that computer. So the equivalent of dialing up that computer and acting as a local user. And the other is we obviously wanted to be able to move a file from one place to another as a sort of base capability. We also understood that if that's all we did, that would be so trivial and so small that it would underplay the obvious capabilities that were coming along. So we should do more. And on the other hand, we also understood that we could not possibly anticipate all of the things that one might want to do with this network. So we were caught in a kind of a bind of not wanting to limit the set of things that were on this initial network and not having any crisp, complete idea that we could put forth with confidence about what the full set of services were going to be. So very unlike the telephone system, which is presented as a finished product, you pick it up and this is what it does and it doesn't do anything else. We wanted to build an open-ended system, one that was extensible and could evolve to other things. And that point of view is exactly counter to any reasonable business model or natural business model. But it was perfectly in sync, perfectly comfortable in this research environment where there wasn't an issue about where the funding was going to come from, and there wasn't a payoff, a competitive payoff for one person coming up with a business that was going to dominate what everybody else does. So a very high degree of cooperation across this environment, and a very low coefficient of competition, if you will. And as I say, I list this as an accident in that there are many other ways in which all of this could have evolved, and had it evolved in a different way, we'd have, I think, a very different system. From a technology point of view, we have a very sharp difference from the way the telephone system evolved. The system was designed to be as stupid as possible. And I say that in a technical sense. That is, there was a minimal amount of service, a minimal amount of smarts inside the network itself. The core network was designed to move packets of information from one point to another relatively efficiently, relatively reliably, didn't have to be 100% reliable, and nothing more. And then to make that available for other services to be built on top. So it's almost inside out compared to the phone system. In the telephone system, when you want to add new capabilities in the olden days, AT&T would have to figure out how it was going to design that, how it was going to put that capability into the switches. The amount of software would expand and expand inside those systems. They'd have to shake it down to make sure that it was absolutely reliable. And it would take a very long time, and you would get very incremental changes. Here, the opportunity for innovation was at the edges, and anybody could design a new service and add it to the network. So that was the Arpanet, and instantaneously, very, very quickly, there was a need to build other networks in three different dimensions. There were new technologies. The idea of packet switching could be applied not just to wireline networks, but also to radio networks, and also to satellite networks. And so that led to packet satellite systems and packet radio systems. And quite obviously, you'd want to interconnect these, but they were technically different networks with different network management and different technologies. And so the idea of connecting multiple networks together became a relatively important and relatively urgent problem to solve. Another force along the same dimension, along the same direction, but from a different quarter, is that the Arpanet was built, as we said, by the Department of Defense, and was limited to essentially contractors working for that office or working for the Department of Defense generally, and for DARPA more particularly. Many other sites wanted to be connected. NASA started its own network. The Department of Energy started its own network in basically parallel ways. And so just within the U.S., we had multiple networks that needed to be connected. And then later, the National Science Foundation sponsored first CSNet and then the NSFNet. And then finally, the idea of building networks caught on rapidly across the world. Once the Arpanet came into existence, other countries began to react, and it became a national priority. Canada said we had to have our own. The UK said they had to have their own. The French said they had to have their own. And very quickly, as these networks started to materialize, or even as they were envisioned, how do you interconnect these networks? Because having each one be isolated was clearly weaker than if you could connect all of them together. So those forces led to the idea of networks and today's internet, and a evolution of the protocols for connecting them. And again, the direction of those of that protocol development was in the direction of what is the minimum, not the maximum. What is the smallest amount that we can do to glue these networks together? And that led to the creation of the IP protocol, Internet Protocol it's called, and then its companion, the Transmission Control Protocol, for creating the virtual notion of a stream or a circuit, basically, that you could send an endless or an unending stream of information toward. So those were the origins, and the fact, as I said, I want to emphasize this, that it all happened kind of out of sight from the main stage of the world. This was not causing a hiccup on Wall Street. This was not causing a hiccup in Fortune 500 companies. There wasn't a lot of money that was quite evidently available. So there was a nice period of time, wasn't exactly planned this way, throughout the 70s and throughout the 80s where things evolved. So we had Telnet and FTP, remote login and file transfer, and very rapidly after that we had email. We scratched our head a little bit and said, email is slow and simple, and yet it's what's dominating. It's the main use of this network. Is that what we had in mind? We had all these grander ideas in mind, but email was clearly dominating everything. Then later, Gopher and Archie for looking things up and storing files and so forth. And then the explosion that came with Mosaic and the World Wide Web, and all of a sudden the world changed considerably. And nonetheless, things remained non-commercial until the early 1990s when it became possible, partly by rethinking some of the regulations and changing some of the bureaucracy, to permit commercial companies to build networks that would interconnect with this base technology. And then things began to explode. In parallel, there were bulletin boards, AOL, CompuServe, and so forth. And they, we typically refer to them as what we call walled gardens, self-contained systems. You enter them, and they are relatively unfriendly toward interconnection with others, except as there are market forces on them. But they basically want to capture you. Marbled through all of this was the rise of various institutions. And when I say institutions, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the term. Institution is a pretty big word, and these were more like forums or user groups. How do we get together to have a discussion about what we're going to do? So in the technical arena for how do you define what the next class of services are on the network, you have to define what we call protocols, the agreements for what computers are going to say to each other. And we started with small forums. We called the first one the Network Working Group, and it evolved over the years into today's Internet Engineering Task Force. So today's IETF has on the order of 100 working groups active at any given time. The face-to-face meetings are 3 times a year for about a week long, and have 1,200 people, give or take, depending upon the location and the state of the economy. Peaked in year 2000 at about 2,000 people at a meeting in London, and came back as the economy declined after that, dropped, and it's been fluctuating. But much of the work in any case is done online, and documents are made available freely. Anybody can get any document anytime, no cost. And for the very longest time, there was no corporate foundation to the organization. There was, if you go and ask, where is the IETF incorporated? There was no answer because it wasn't an incorporated operation. If you ask, what is its legal structure, you'd get a very fuzzy answer. If you'd ask, what is the formality of taking the work that's done there and transforming it into a standard, the answers were very uncomfortable for people who'd grown up in a formal standards environment. Documents would be published, and people would agree to them, and then build products that would meet those, that would work in those ways. And it was market forces really that was the enforcement mechanism, rather than a court or a regulatory body or any kind of official. If you found a product that was not in conformance with the published standard, there wasn't any place you could go to and say that product is not in conformance, it should be taken off the market. That would be there'd be nobody to say that to, and nobody would listen, except if people stop buying the product. That's a very strong statement. So that was kind of the notion of a quote institution, and there were other institutions, if you will, that grew up similarly. the allocation of IP addresses is a clerical task that has to be done, but it has to be done in an orderly way. And over time, we now have what do we call regional internet registries, RIRs, and we have roughly one per continent. So the one for North America is called ARIN, and its headquarters is out near Dulles. But we also have an organization called RIPE in Europe, in Amsterdam, APNIC in the Asia-Pacific region, Latin American, Caribbean, LACNIC in Montevideo, and the AFRINIC in Africa, which is operating out of Mauritius and some other locations. One element which I've been heavily involved in recently is the domain name system, and for a very, very long time, the domain name system was administered by John Postel as a adjunct to the research that he'd been doing for many years. And as this became bigger and more unwieldy than could be managed by a researcher operating out of a university, University of Southern California, there was a sort of urgent requirement to create some alternative institution, and that led to the creation of ICANN in the late 1990s. Another element that is very important in all of this is an understanding that we're dealing with a relatively complex system that is, and the complexity is managed by dividing it up into layers. So this gets back to the technology side of things, that instead of offering a single integrated service, the internet is really many, many layers of services that are built on top of each other. And it is that layering that provides the opportunity for innovation, and it also is that layering that has a first order significant impact on the creation and evolution of the institutions that provide service to the community. And I use the word service to deliberately to change the notion from talk about internet governance. Actually, a large part of what needs to be done under the heading of governance is much more in the notion of administering in a orderly way, in a non-interfering way as much as possible, the few services that need to be done centrally to make the internet work, and trying to stay out of the way. And so that's a very different posture from we're in charge and you can't do anything until you ask us, or you have to come and negotiate, or we have to broker deals. We want as little of that as possible so that there is as much innovation. After the 1990s, the early 1990s, you had this enormous explosion, a huge increase in the users. Commercial use of the internet became possible. Interconnection around the world, you have a genuine world is flat phenomena. New services started to come along, Google, Skype, Twitter, Facebook. Who would have expected that the big breakthrough in voice over the internet? And I have to tell you that we did early experiments on voice over the Arpanet at Harvard in the late 60s, early 70s. So it wasn't that the idea was brand new, but that the thing that actually has made the huge difference and created just an explosion, and I would bet everybody here actually is a user, the development of Skype in Estonia. I would not have been able to find Estonia on a map back in those days, and it would have just been novel idea that that's where the innovation was going to come from. And then in parallel with all this, humans being the way we are, you get a few ills that accompany it: spam, crime, pornography, political speech, hate speech, and all sorts of things that bring in all the emotions and other aspects of human behavior. So in that explosion, you have a few big problems. Arab Spring kind of phenomena where you have threats to political establishments and all of a sudden the internet is viewed as something that is inconsistent with the current political regime. You have the sharp challenge to the telephone business. Telephone business has declined considerably. Now voice is viewed in essence as an application that runs on top of the internet as opposed to being the system of its own. Am I being told I'm running too long?
No,
Questions
we're getting
coming
some
in.
questions
All right.
coming in.
I will pause in a moment. And another aspect is international crime, and how do you deal with international crime in an environment that doesn't provide natural mechanisms for cooperation across these international boundaries. So that brings us to current environment and a lot of topics that are thrown into this general basket of internet governance, from combating crime to dealing with protection of existing institutions to sovereignty kinds of questions. I jotted down Westphalia was a quaint idea. The idea of nation states and having complete control of everything in your borders. We also, of course, have huge culture clashes. It's much easier to have a particular mindset in a contained geographic environment if there's only a limited amount of commerce and interaction and communication across those boundaries. If the people inside of those boundaries can talk to people outside those boundaries, ideas can flow back and forth, and it leads to some very unhappy degrees of turbulent situations. Tiananmen Square, jihads. The French don't like it if somebody is selling Nazi memorabilia on eBay and it's accessible from France. So there's a huge spectrum across all of the human dimensions. So the bad guys are having a field day, and yet the idea of shutting down the internet to kill off the bad guys would have even worse consequences, because the rest of us have benefiting even more. So where does that leave us with governance? It leaves us just with a whole set of open problems. The key one is that governance is not the same as government, that the idea of governing the internet necessarily involves, yes, governments, but also civil society, business, academia, and technologists. And some of the changes are huge, and some of the changes are humorous. Go to an IETF meeting, take off your tie. Sandals are probably the appropriate dress. Another key thing, not quite so humorous, is that the speed at which things move is quite different. Things operate in what we call internet time, and they operate by consensus and running code. Come up with a great political idea about how to organize things, and you will get far less attention than if you come up with a protocol design and code that implements that and say, how about this? And then people can stand around and look at it closely and debate it back and forth. So the old institutions are struggling to find their place and to find a comfortable balance, sort of posture for operating in this environment. And so with that, I will now pause for a breath and invite you to poke at, pick at, ask about anything that I've covered or not. Or things that I haven't covered.
All right, why don't we take a couple of questions from the audience, and I have some questions here, and let me invite our online audience to submit questions as well. I have a first one. I'll start this one from Mike Nelson. Who has followed this area for a long time. He says, all eyes are on Wicked in Dubai, but the ITU and WTSA met and set up deep packet inspection standards. Should we be worried?
Deep packet inspections, I would be deeply worried. Let's see, so let me unpack that for people who have not been following. The term deep packet inspection refers to watching traffic as it goes by the various switches and pathways on the internet, and looking not just at the headers to figure out where to send the packet and how to route it, but looking inside the content to see what's being said, who's saying it, and all of that. So deep packet inspection is used by law enforcement to look at criminal or terrorist behavior or the like, but it can also be used by people who want to snoop on violate your privacy, or the flip side of that, people who want to provide you additional service by understanding what's of interest to you, commercial, advertising, sort of micro-targeting your interests. In general, once my own view is once you look inside, then we have great difficulty, sort of open-ended set of ills that are going to come. An interesting point of view is what would happen if traffic was encrypted from the origin, from the point of origin, and not decrypted until it reached where it went, precisely to thwart the idea of deep packet inspection. What changes would that bring in a practical sense to all of the different dimensions, to from a privacy point of view, from a law enforcement point of view, and from a commercial effectiveness point of view?
Take a question from the audience, and please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Bjorn Cooley. Oh, fantastic, get a mic. Hi, my name is Bjorn Cooley. And so you mentioned a few times that you built the internet based on the idea that you do the minimum possible or necessary to allow the system to essentially flourish.
Right.
I think that, especially in Washington, D.C., we see that in many ways as kind of an attractive method for government or politics or the more flesh and blood systems and networks that we have in the world. So do you see the fact that the internet has flourished based on the minimum necessary as a sort of a possible model for looking at other institutions or systems in the flesh and blood world?
Yeah. So the natural trap for anybody who's put up on stage and given a voice is to think that we can take the experience that we have in one area and generalize it and pontificate. It's a great temptation to do that. Quite obviously, there is an attractive model there of minimality, I don't think there's anything deep in suggesting that might be adaptable in other environments. And indeed, if one looks at the U.S. Constitution, the idea that government powers are limited and that the prerogatives not specifically enumerated are left to the states in one dimension and to the people, to individuals in another dimension, is pretty deep in our culture, not so deep in other cultures, and we can have our own guesses as to what we like and what we think has succeeded. But so that, I think, is a positive response to your question. But that said, let me go back to my first point, which is I think it's always very important to take any analogy and look to see how well it fits and what the limits and sort of goodness of fit is to that idea, and not just say, well, look at the internet, we should be just like the internet. Well, a lot of things are different.
Let me just have a clarifying question. If you could just briefly describe, the ICON was established in the late 1990s, not part of the ITU, not part of the traditional international telecommunications regulatory structure. Is that accurate?
Yes. So I touched on this only lightly, and I'm sure my colleagues at ICANN would be wishing that I'd say a lot more, so here's the opportunity. The domain name system everybody's familiar with, like www.hudson.org, and that is divided up into three parts, the last of which is .org, and which is called a top-level domain, and there's a series of top-level domains, com, net, org, one for every country, .uk, .fr for France, .de for Germany, for example. One of the tasks that devolved to ICANN is overseeing the and providing orderly service in the maintenance of the information related to those top-level domains. So there is a zone of information called the root zone that has a list of all the top-level domains and of the critical pieces of information related to those top-level domains. And because of the way the internet evolved, and here I go back and emphasize the accidental nature of the birth and the history, the creation of the of the domain name system and the administration of it happened in a very low-key, unremarkable way, and then flourished and grew and eventually got to be a very big deal. But the management of that top level was done essentially by John Postel and a very small team of people that he worked with, until it became a politically unfeasible situation. The University of Southern California, where he was working, started to receive letters, threatening letters from other countries saying, we don't like a decision you made, we're going to sue you. And the USC lawyers said, my goodness, what business are we in here? The White House convened a series of meetings, and papers were written, and out of that, ICANN, which is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, was created, and it was created as a separate freestanding organization. Happens to be incorporated as a nonprofit in the state of California, which causes a lot of angst for people in other parts of the world, but fundamentally it's serving the entire globe and is organized for that purpose. And was given the task of continuing to administer the domain name system and the other identifiers that are relevant to the internet, particularly the address space, and then more things that are a bit harder to describe, but the protocol parameters that go into the IETF-generated protocols. That process has become very political, but it also has a very strong technical component to it, and that's the job that ICANN does on a day-in and day-out basis. Another element is that, as it happened, the original definition of top-level domains, there was a .mil for the U.S. military, a .gov for the civilian side of the U.S. government, both reflecting the origins of this process. You wouldn't do it from scratch these days and give such primary attention to one government, or and certainly not to each half of the government. A .net, which was intended to be the home for what you would now call ISPs, a .org for nonprofits that were doing research, .edu for the universities, and for the few commercial organizations that were part of this environment that didn't fit in the other, there was this tiny little .com that was created. As soon as the internet was opened up to commercial use, .com started to grow, and now 120 million or whatever names are registered under .com. It is a very, very big business. VeriSign operates it. They're a publicly traded company. We're talking about billions of dollars for something that started out as a very modest thing. So that's the role of ICANN. Did I get to the
yes.
question? So it's created totally divorced, totally independent of ICANN, of ITU, and the only there was an attention to a global aspect, which is the board is composed by bylaw, by its own bylaws, requires geographic representation from all 5 regions of the world. And so we have a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 5 people on the board from every region of the world.
A related question from David McCauley. Can you comment on ICON's enhanced engagement with the ITU, the CEO, and maybe
Fadi Shahadi.
mentioned in Dubai?
Yeah. So in this environment where the internet grew up in one direction and the telephone system grew up in a different, it's very natural that there would be a sense of competition. And that competition then shows up in the interactions between the organizations. And not just ICANN, but other internet-related organizations, the Internet Society, the IETF, and others, have had a somewhat rocky relationship with the ITU. What is the proper relationship? And the ITU, because it's a UN treaty organization and is the only membership is the only full membership is through governments, and there is a secondary kind of membership, sector membership, that is possible if you're a company, and you have to buy your way in, and all of the rules of engagement are completely different from the internet experience. There's been a kind of wariness and difficulty of engagement. We took on a new CEO 6 months ago. Actually, we formally announced him about 6 months ago, and he didn't start until about 3 months ago. In fact, 3 months ago minus 2 days. And part of his posture and part of the board's posture is an attempt to be to look for ways of being a lot more cooperative and a lot less uncomfortable or adversarial or confrontational with other organizations in general. As a piece of this, our posture was received warmly by the Secretary General of the ITU, Hamadoun Touré, and echoed back. And in the opening day of the Wicket a week ago, Monday, so we're talking about Monday last week, Touré made a point of, in his opening speech, very explicitly saying that he doesn't view that the ITU and ICANN need to be in competition, that sort of stay out of each other's hair, and that they're not going to be involved in the internet infrastructure. I should pull up the exact words. And even more strongly invited our CEO to make some remarks during the opening ceremony, which is extraordinary because there's not naturally a position for that. But between Touré as the Secretary General and the host of the meeting, the chair of the meeting, was the equivalent of the FCC, head of the FCC for United Arab Emirates, invited Fadi Shahadi to make some opening remarks. Shahadi and I were both, and Tarek Kamel, our senior advisor for government affairs, were all special guests of the secretary, and so that was a very high point in cooperation and say warmth between the organizations. We then left. We're not really part of the ITU negotiations, and we've been watching actively over the last week and a half. And of course, you have the pressures from all of the different countries with different proposals, many of which are far less comfortable, far less cooperative, and we'll see where all of that comes out.
Question in the back.
Nina Shea, I direct the Center for Religious Freedom here at Hudson Institute. And I found your talk very fascinating. I'm not very technological myself, so it was all very enlightening. I have seen articles that worried that ICON may be taken over by the United Nations, and that it would cease to be, I guess, a private nonprofit at this point, and that there was an interest, on the part of the majority of the United Nations to start censoring it, I guess what you call deep pocket inspections, and through ICON. Can you comment on that? I'm a little confused about all of that, where
Yeah.
that stands and whether it's even possible. And one of the things that we track is the limits, restrictions on speech that certain religions are hoping to universalize.
Good. Thank you. I'm pleased for your question because you've put at least two things together that don't belong anywhere close to each other, and so I want to take the opportunity to tease them apart very carefully. The business of the UN taking over ICANN is exactly related to this wicket meeting that's in progress, and whether or not there would be formal resolutions that would assert authority or control over the naming and addressing system, which is where we are, what we do at ICANN. And in Touré's opening remarks, he said, we're not going to do that. There are proposals that are being batted back and forth, as I alluded to in the opening missive that I read, that says that not everybody there is comfortable about that, and some countries are still putting proposals on the table. I would be, I think it's safe to say that those proposals are not going to succeed this week. That doesn't mean they're going to be permanently dead and there isn't going to be subsequent activity of that. The role of ICANN is limited to the domain name system and the addressing system, and only the top layers of that. We have absolutely nothing to do with the actual operation of the internet. We have no access to the traffic that passes through the internet. We don't even have access to the operations of the domain name system below the top level. So I'll come to deep packet inspection in just a minute, but I want to kill off one other thing. Many people think that we are either responsible or can be responsible for what sites are taken off the internet. So let's say that there's a site that has infringing content, copyright, infringing on the copyright of others, and a law enforcement authority, either in the U.S. or elsewhere, goes and takes that site down. Sometimes we are viewed as having facilitated that or being in charge of that or whatever. And the answer is none of that. We don't have any way of making it happen. We don't have any way of not making it happen. Structurally, if you ask, so what controls do we actually have? We have a role, not unilateral, in the top-level domains that are in or out of the root. You could make up a nightmare scenario in which you could say, well, can't ICANN take country X out of the root? The answer is we can't, because there are a lot of safeguards and controls, and it would require cooperation from other parties. But even if we could, that would be a cataclysmically stupid thing to do, and would have immediate negative consequences. I mean, we would never want to be in that position. And there's nothing finer grained that we have access to at all. With respect to the deep packet inspection, that is, if it's done at all, it's done elsewhere. It's done by ISPs. It's done by filters, firewalls. You know, in the Great Wall of China, they have mechanisms sort of encircling the country and so forth. And that is completely unrelated to us. The work at the ITU is not limited to whether or not they are or aren't going to have an impact on ICANN. They look at the entire spectrum of stuff related to telecommunications. And so any aspect of the internet, whether or not it relates to ICANN, is fair game for them to have a discussion. So they can have a discussion about deep packet inspection, and it may have dramatic consequences, but it wouldn't have any dramatic consequences with respect to ICANN.
We could stay here all afternoon and ask questions of Mr. Crocker, but I invite the audience, and many of you have questions that haven't been addressed yet, to I'm sure Mr. Crocker will stay for a few minutes afterwards to take questions. But let's have a round of applause for Dr. Stephen Crocker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.